And we are live. It's KTLO, keeping the learning on. Today, we are here at episode 41. See, I didn't do my little shtick where I get puzzled about the episode number. I didn't even do that today. Is it? Yes, it is episode 41. Haha, fooled you. I did it anyway. It is, in fact, episode 41. And today, our title is An Episode for the Aegis. Clever play on words. And what is the Aegis? Well, we'll talk about that at some length today. That is Athena with the Aegis on the screen. That is courtesy of the University of North Carolina and their classics department. And speaking of classics, we certainly are classics here. The core four for KTLO, Patty Blackstaff in Western Canada, Greg Sanker in Western USA, Simone Jomore in Southwestern France, as we determined last week. And I am in the western part of North Carolina, so we are Western in different countries, so that makes us country and never mind. Moving right along, see, we're just shaking our heads and saying Roy's at it again. If you want to reach us, here's how to do that on Twitter. Our handles are there. We are all on LinkedIn, and we do have guests with us today. And we're going to get to that in a moment. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing that screen. And we'll go to gallery view as people join us. There we have Daniel Breston. Say hello to the nice people, Daniel.
Morning, Daniel.
And
hello, nice people.
And we have Mark Thomas with us this morning.
Hey, Mark.
He's just popping in. And we have G. Burgoyne.
Good morning, Mark. Today.
It's a regular gallery of a plethora of people. And we have also Kathy Velboom, who's one of our regulars. So look at all the nice people. And Greg.
Did Mark Thomas send you the memo then? Is that what?
That's well, no, I have a long-standing memo, Greg.
Dang, Greg, no love this morning.
No love at all. So we're going to talk about the Aegis today and what does it mean and what is it? And just basically, if you're not familiar with the wiles of classical literature, the Aegis is variously described as, and Simone will talk a little bit about this as well, it's something that protects both Zeus, or as it's pronounced in Greek, Zeus, and Athena, his daughter, who sprang from his brain, Athena, and provides protection. It's used militarily. Some of you might be familiar with the Aegis system, which is an overarching system of protection used heavily in the U.S. Navy, provides a tremendous amount of cover around ships to prevent things from flying into ships. And so we're going to talk about that level of protection and some of the symbolic things that go along with the Aegis. And so the interviewer du jour is Simone. And so I'm just going to hand it over to you. And we have lots of questions. And I know this is going to be a very lively discussion today. So I'm going to put us in speaker view. And over to you, Simone.
Merci, monsieur. Bon après-midi à tous. Wow, this is fantastic. This topic has, it's almost like the heads of the Hydra, isn't it? It's one of those topics that just keeps coming back. And if we don't deal with it, it's going to end up biting you somewhere, some way, somehow. It's interesting when we chose Athena at the Aegis, and of course my thoughts around Athena, archetypes have always fascinated me. And in those archetypes, no matter what you look at, we look for characteristics, we look for the behaviors, the ideals, the values, what we want to work with. And Athena's always been a goddess after my own heart, given I was a female soldier, but it's actually more than that. I was fourth generation to serve. And so under my father and great uncles and others, I've always felt what I would say under their aegis, under their support, under their protection. And that's what sort of moved me forward in looking at all the careers that we take on and how we serve. But when I think about that, I'm starting to wonder, was I actually governed or guided or both? And I think this is also a very interesting question to ask and answer about our organizations. So, Greg, you talk a lot about governance. Is it because governance is important, or is there a weakness there?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, governance is critical. You can't have a functional organization without governance. And I think where we get stuck on governance is we think of it so much as, command and control and decision making tops down and so on and so forth. And that is a form of governance. But that is not the meaning of governance. Guidance is governance. Delegating decision-making is governance. Democracy is like governance. There's a lot of forms of governance. But here's what I see in organizations is if there's not clarity in decision-making and authority, prioritization of resources, and the ongoing monitoring of those resources to ensure that we're achieving the business objectives of that organization, that's where we struggle. And in order to move quickly, we have to have that level of clarity in organizations. And so in all my years in organizations, I find that that's where the biggest weakness is in either it's unclear how we're being governed or the governance is just weak and ineffective. I think both happen.
Okay, so Roy, what's the difference then, if I think about having clarity around this, what's the difference between governance and regulation?
Regulation is certainly one aspect of governance, but there are many others. And the idea of having guidance and the idea of having to do something one specific way are slightly different from each other. Guidance might tell you you have a range of options. It might tell you that you have a range of authority, whereas a regulation may say you must do it specifically this way. And guidance can be appended to regulation. So a regulation says, we stipulate that your bank has to file something every quarter. And then there might be guidance that falls out from underneath that says, okay, here's some of the ways that you might be able to do that. Here's some of the things that you can and cannot do within boundaries. So I think they're related to each other. And I think that part of what we're going to get to today is that governance is a little bit bigger and different from a lot of the other ways that we typically think about control, regulation, legality, all of those things. It's a little bit bigger than that.
So, Patty, I'm going to come to you on this one because we talk about what's bigger than what we've just heard.
So it depends on the level of governance that you're talking about, right? There is a number of different frameworks that lead to what we recognize as IT governance, and they come far above us. And one of those is the shareholders. They've got the Articles of Association. Then you look at the supervisory board, and the board defines some specific governance around the organization, such as audit, nomination, remuneration, that kind of thing. And then you have your managing board of corporate, and that's a form of governance. So I think it is much bigger when you look at the layers, and then you understand the necessity and the need for how those layers filter down to operational governance. And operational governance has its hands either tied or confused based on the governance that comes before it in order to define what may feel more at the lower levels like constraints, but is guidance for a reason. I think we are we fail to understand, if we're not transparent, we fail to understand what that governance is trying to define for us at those frontline layers, right? Yeah.
So I'm just wondering then, because of that lack of clarity and that failure to understand as well at the different levels, I'm not surprised that it leads to so much command and control. I mean, the word governance is like control to so many people, but it really harkens back, I guess, to that industrial age style of management, which is not what we enjoy very much at all. So what's your take on that, Greg?
You just want to rile me up, don't you? Right?
Yeah. So I'm just going to wind that screw.
Awesome. I might be having some technical troubles. I'll tune back in. No, so the thing is, and Simone, you got to let Mark Thomas jump in on this topic, really. But one of the things about controls, and I use them regularly because compliance frameworks have controls in them. COBIT was a control objective framework from the get-go, and I've used that as injecting in some certain non-negotiable elements in however we achieve certain processes or practices or capabilities within the organization. So controls are one of the ways that the industry articulates non-negotiable elements that need to be there. And I'm using the wrong language. I'm looking at Mark, because Mark's the guy that taught me all this stuff, right? So this is really awkward for me. But those controls are how we regulate the functioning of an organization. So if we make an analogy, airplanes have hundreds of controls in which they fly very, very fast. Automobiles have controls like brakes and steering wheels and other elements that allow us to drive very fast. I always ask the question, how fast would you drive an automobile that has no brakes? And most of us, the answer is very, very slow, for fear that we're going to smack the wall or hit another car or pedestrian or something like that. So controls are not command and control, disrespectful, tops down, you must do this, don't do any thinking, follow the procedure as it's commonly perceived as, but there are ways that we can actually accelerate the performance of your organization by being clear, these are non-negotiables. Beyond that, let's move very, very quickly.
I think it's your turn, Mark. You can't resist that. Not after that lead in.
I have no counterpoints. However, I do have a couple things. So Simone, you started off saying, talking about earlier in your life and your career, you said you were not governed over this. And I think that's a key point. You cannot govern yourself. And I think a lot of organizations, and I want to get to something that Patty said a few minutes ago too, but wherever you are in an organization, there's always a governing body of some type above you. And most people in the traditional thinking, old-fashioned business was we have a board of directors, board of regents, whatever that highest level governing body is. And what they do is they usually communicate to the organization through the use of committees and those types of things. But when it comes to IT governance, a lot of people literally read the term exactly like it was: IT, govern yourselves. And you can't govern yourself. So if I'm asked to govern myself, what you're asking me to do is make up my own rules, determine which of my own rules I choose to follow, and determine the consequences for those rules I choose to break. So I'm going to hurt myself and the organization. And that goes to something, Patty, I really like that she talked about, depending on the level of governance. Because if I ask a CIO, who's your governing body? A CIO, I'd say it's the board of directors and the executive steering committee. Those are the two governing bodies that guide my decision work and my craft in management. If I ask a brand new business analyst or a project manager, who is your governing body? She's not going to say the board of directors. She's going to say, oh, the project steering committee, the appropriate board. And I think where organizations that I see are getting sideways is they create a governing body for everything. Did a study with the international manufacturer not too long ago. And we looked at all of my charter was to inventory all of their governing bodies and tell them what was wrong. They had over 60 different committees, boards, including like a change board, right? That's technically speaking, a change board is a governing body. And they had over 60 of these. And we found out that less than half had some type of charter. They didn't even know what their decision boundaries, they didn't know levels of authorities, all those things. And that was really embarrassing for them. So the charges for most of us is we all sit on a governing body. And what we do is we determine the rules. right? Or the guidelines, right? But when we leave that governing body, we now have to execute our actions in line with what that governing body says. But we also have another governing body over here that made up rules too. And those rules they made up just happen to overlap, and they actually might negate rules of other bodies. And so I think, I love governance, but I think there's such a thing as too much governance, which is now, especially with things like Daniel on the value streaming, those kinds of things. We have to be able to delegate authority a little bit better, and we're starting to see that now. But I read an article from the Institute of Internal Auditors that said, all of a sudden this year, 2021, we're going to start auditing governance. And my point was, when did we actually stop? I mean, we probably should have been looking at governance for quite some time, but I think there's a delegation that we need to start looking at. With the frameworks are starting to see that. The frameworks are actually starting to see that. So anyway, it goes to, so earlier, Simone, I believe you asked what's the difference between governance and regulation. Well, that's what GRC is, governance, risk, and compliance. You can't be 100% compliant to everything, guys. All right, that's where risk is. That's where I have to be willing to not put 100% of a control in place because of the cost benefit of it. Now, of course, if somebody's going to be physically harmed, right, that's a no-brainer. But in some cases, I think there are a lot of organizations, especially with the cybersecurity scares right now. Everybody wants to be overly compliant. If you become overly compliant, guess what? You can't perform.
You'll never get anything
yeah.
done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, Patty, Mark's brought up some really interesting things. We've talked a lot in the past about like self-governing teams or being able to make, in the absence of rules, we'll do it the way we think best how. And that's not always necessarily the best way for the outcome that we're trying to achieve and so on. And whatever level I happen to be at, hey, all of a sudden the decision is in my boat. I get to make the decision, which sometimes feels good. In other ways, possibly not necessarily a good idea, because it's going to be based purely on my purview, purely on my experience or the context in my role. You talk a lot around complexity, especially around in that human space. So how do you see what Mark's talked about relating to that side of things?
Well, I'll jump into that in a second, but I want to touch on a couple of things that I heard today. And I think what Mark and Greg both brought up, and what a whole bunch of people on this panel were nodding about, is this understanding of structure. When we talk about flattening organizations and we talk about removing some of the oversight in terms of decision-making and that stuff and making people autonomous, that doesn't mean let's remove governance, right? And that's one of the most important things. We have to remember there are some specific things we need to address. We have to understand what our structure is, what our oversight responsibilities are at all layers, what the talent and culture required to do the work is, and what the infrastructure needs to be. And so as we move through some really cool ideas, such as continuous improvement, such as an agile organization, all of those kinds of things. We hear and Greg has talked about this so much, we hear this rally cry of, let's get rid of all the rules. It's, we're going to be self-governed. And as Mark said, you cannot govern yourself. And as we move into these ideas and these cool things that other people are doing well and we're trying to mimic and copy, we have to recognize that human beings have only two layers outside of their knowledge base of understanding. That in order, human complexity is such that I have to experience some things before I can get 6 layers out. I have to go through a few of these layers of complexity in order to understand. So if I'm still managing at a 1940s management structure in my organization, and I have a 1970s style of command and control, or 1950s, and I'm looking at trying to build this agile organization, we're going to go through some stuff before we'll ever get there. And what we need to focus on is, how is the governance changing? How is the structure, oversight, talent, and infrastructure changing? What is the framework for that? And to not muddy it up with, well, we have to govern agile over here, and we have to govern this over here, and we have to. So I really loved what Mark said about how we need to learn to delegate the stuff that people can do and govern the things that make us who we are.
Oh, that is so cool. You made me think about all the stuff that we have to go through to get from, one layer to another, and from one state of being to the state of being we're trying to be in itself. And I often wonder if one of the key roles in governance, and in their governance framework or in the governance team, should actually be governance psychologist. And speaking of our local philosopher and psychologist, Roy, I have a little question for you.
How do you feel about that?
How do you feel about that? Governance misunderstood, yes? I mean, obscure or obtuse? I mean, how are people seeing this?
No, I'm obscure and obtuse. Governance, well, yeah, everything is misunderstood. And here's why. It's a very simple thing, really. If you think about a game you probably played at a party or in your childhood, you play the game of telephone. I say something to the person next to me, who repeats it to the person next to them, who repeats it to the person next to them. By the time it gets through 10, 15, 20 people, however many people you have, the message is entirely distorted at the other end of the chain, right? We find this, all of us have been frustrated by the fact that people saying, well, a certain framework that we subscribe to doesn't work. It doesn't work because of A, B, and C. And you say, wait a minute, the framework doesn't say that. And the reason that they believe it says that is because they were told that by somebody else who was told that by somebody else. The more layers of communication you have, the more distorted the message becomes, unless the message is very clear and very simple. And I think that kind of fits into thinking about the things we're trying to communicate too. But so governance is just one of those things that becomes progressively misunderstood. And there was another part of your question too, and I've gone off on the language tangent as usual, and now I've confused you. Oh, what was it? Obscure and obtuse. That was it. That's it. I guess I was being obtuse. Well, I think the word that we started with somewhere along the line during this discussion was obfuscation. And I think that that's what happens in the telephone game, is that things become obfuscated. They become confused and unclear as we try to communicate them. And being a firm believer in clear communication, I think that that's one of the things that governance provides. And we're going to come back to that. I think clarity is one of the things that we need to get to.
Yeah, we definitely will. There's a few other key points. I know that, based on the all the conversations we've had before on this topic, there's so many tangents that we can take. Speaking of tangents, Daniel, one of the things about clarity and what you've heard so far, Mark has mentioned you do a lot of work around trying to clarify those communications, understand where things are through your value stream mapping and that kind of thing. What's your take on what we've been discussing about governance being, us being under that Aegis?
I'm going to look at this from an IT manager or product owner's perspective, and they want to do something new, and it's 2019. In which case, then, they had to go and create a business case, and they had to submit that business case. And I'm also going to assume that the organization is still fragile, not agile. And they had to go and submit that business case, even though they didn't know exactly what it would take, asking for resources, money, tools, people, something, for something that they weren't quite sure of, and go through various rounds of this before they got what they needed to be able to create the service or product that would help either their internal teams, if they were creating stuff for staff, or for whatever they want to do for their customers. Now I'm going to look at May, June 2020. We're all at home. Our business is dying. We need to do whatever it is that we need to do, and we need to do it now to get people working and supporting staff and working and supporting customers. And if it doesn't work in the morning, but it works in the afternoon, hey, that's great. That was an experiment and we learned something. And the next time we need to do something, we continue to do that. And for a large portion of the planet, and I'm in the UK, so maybe I should just focus here, but for a large, for most of the UK, we're still in that world. We're not asking people to come to 1 hour change advisory board, to wind up Greg, asking for approval. Okay, we're just empowered, authorized, able, whatever word you'd like to put in there, based on some guidelines and guardrails that say, if you want to try this and it's within this remit and you do it this way and you include this, then knock your socks off. But if it's going to help us do stuff, then let's do stuff. And that's what I think, whatever word you want to put about it, value stream mapping or stuff, is able to visualize what you were doing and visualize what you can do to improve it. And governance, I think, is actually there not to control. Governance is there, as all of us have said, to show people how to improve. And now I'll go back to mute.
Oh, you said some interesting things there. One of the key points that came up for me, though, is what we would normally call like locus of control. So we're talking about empowering people, authorizing them, enabling them, giving them the guardrails or those guidelines in which to make decisions and operate. And sometimes, our locus of control can be quite elastic in some organizations and rigid in others. So Kathy, I want to come to you because you deal a lot with frontline staff and you're there supporting them. So what is that governance impact on the frontline guys? What's their locus of control versus, I guess, what some people might see as obeying the rules versus seeing it as backup and support?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah. This is a topic that stays top of mind in technical support or customer support or parts of the organization. Sometimes support is, oh, well, it's just like our IT team, they support, well, these guys are just supporting customers and they try and throw us that way. And then you get into things that IT doesn't face. They don't face vendors or organizations trying to control vendors' remote access to their system. They don't understand the level to which we may see very sensitive data in the system. We struggle with customers wanting to have their own unique governances on us. And how do we manage all of that if we can't get to a situation where we get them within more of our normal way of doing business? How do we start to adhere to all of those different regulations that organization wants to put on top of us? Then you layer in HIPAA, then you layer in GDPR, and all of this makes it really important that we operate under guidelines. Technical support is one that runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So there are times when someone, maybe a level 3 engineer or what it may be, they're in the seat, they have to make a decision now. And then it's up to management to support them in that. And if something happens within the organization I work a lot with regulatory teams. If something comes up and they get, their feathers ruffled, we just have to explain that we have to be able to make decisions on the fly. With the training that we have and in the best interest of the company and the customer.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical thing, is that if we are completely focused on making those choices, especially when there's some gray space, and this happens a lot in different parts of the organization where that gray space is, that if we can keep that focus around what is the outcome, what is the reason, what is the purpose for this, and keep to the intent, more often than not,
Yeah.
it will go the right way. We know it doesn't always go that way. Patty, what are your comments around this?
Well, I think 2020 was the year of enablement. So how do we enable ourselves to do business? How do we continue doing business with these new external environmental constraints that are now imposed upon us, that we must be able to figure out a way to make that work? But if that was enablement, 2021 needs to be what worked, what didn't, and what did we discover, and not an attempt to return to past days, right? I believe that what did we learn and what did we discover could be many, many things. And is it wise to set governance based on those discoveries? And I think that takes an enormous amount of work for an organization and some organizational introspection to be able to understand that. For instance, for organizations that had never used Teams but then began using Teams, now they have a SharePoint issue. For organizations that had always been tightly, very carefully, how do I say this, restricted in the amount of tools they use, suddenly through Zoom out there, and now they have to understand what that means. Some are discovering that those servers are in China. What does that mean for us? What does that, some of those kinds of things. So there's a lot of discovery that needs to happen based on how we created the enablement that allowed us to do what we are doing and how we experimented through it. We really, really, if at all times in the world we needed a systematic lessons learned way of going through this to understand what needs governance and what doesn't, it's now.
Yeah, definitely. You do a fair bit of work around organizations doing introspection and having gone through their experiments and what they've ended up, should I say, what level of enlightenment or level of mess they may have found themselves in at the time. So where do you think that has taken us, that creation of the enablement, which has been great, but
Yes.
there's always two sides to the coin. So how is governance focused in what you've seen?
I love what we've been talking about, and I have some notes here that I've made that I want to make sure I touch on. I think it really is important to do the introspection and the examination of basically what they call the debriefing or the autopsy. But I think a lot of organizations that I'm working with are finding it's difficult to do that to pull over and change the tire when they're going 65 miles an hour still. So that has to be a very, very intentional thing from the top, that you perhaps call somebody in that will keep their eye on the ball, but they're still business as usual. They're muddling forward. It's healthcare is what I work with the most, and it is the very most regulated industry out there. What I've been suggesting is that we start from an absolute clarity. So communication has to be three things. Has to be absolutely clear, absolutely caring, and absolutely credible. Those three things. It comes to trust, it comes to people, because what we're working with, what we're balancing risk with, is the focus and needs of the business versus, and you mentioned this, the people. All of this from the very top, no matter, it gets really bulky up there, really crowded, but what it comes down to is that moment at the front line between a person and either a patient or a customer. So if I like the idea of the guardrails. I think of like bumpers when you're trying to bowl, and and you're not really good. So they put the bumpers on you can ask them to do that so that your ball will not go out of the space. I'm thinking we could throw out, if we could think of it from a standpoint of being really clear about the mission and the values, and then the absolute, here is what you absolutely don't ever, never do, ever, then people could make a decision, because there's never going to be policies and procedures that address every single situation. That the possibilities are in the bazillions. So I just will end with this. I worked with, here's something for organizations to think about. I worked with a hospital once, and they did a very thorough, in those days it was called employee satisfaction survey, and it keeps changing. But a key question that they asked employees was, in this organization, and we talked a little bit here about risk and it being the gray area, what happens when you take a risk and you succeed? Okay. And then the second half of the question was, what happens when you take a risk and you fail? And when you look at an organization, the difference between those two answers is what's going to happen at your front lines. And I don't think most businesses are in the business of obeying rules. When it says, what's your mission? Our mission is to obey the rules. No, it's not. So the more we can put those guardrails up and let them go, I think at the front lines, the better.
Yeah, the guys have heard me talk about this a little bit before. I like to ask people, you know, build me a sandcastle. We've all got a different idea of what that might be. If I don't give you what my design is, or what my guidelines are, or what my expectation is, then you will go ahead and do, from your own experience, whatever you think that is. And you've just asked exactly the right questions. If I have a meter by meter sandbox, but it's made out of splintery wood and it's got rusty nails in it, there's some risks associated with playing in that sandbox, right? I could be on a whole beach and have a huge amount to play with, but the fact is people forget, well, being an Aussie and used to the beach, a lot of people that go there do forget there are rock pools with bitey things in them and stuff that stings, and the tide, it actually comes in and reduces what you're able to do. And then the tide goes out and you go, oh, wow, at this time I can do X, Y, Z. But I've only got this amount of time before the tide comes back in again. So for me, risk is always those outer edges. It's always what are those things that can happen. Greg, this is a really a big topic for you, because when Dee was saying, you know, communication has to be clear, it has to be caring, but it also has to be credible. That's really stood out to me. It has to be credible, because the risk thing, if it's not credible, if people don't believe it's a risk or they don't understand the risk, they're just going to ignore it.
I made note of that as well, credible, because people will follow things that they believe is somewhat rooted in reality or makes sense or whatever. We run that through a filter. But as I was thinking about that, it's like there's this understanding that risk is situational. Our appetite for risk is dependent on the circumstances in which we're operating. So you gave the example of, actually it was Daniel, thank you, Daniel, 2019, our view of the situational risk was very, very different than May of 2020. And we were tacitly, in most cases, willing to take a much higher, incur a much higher level of risk, because the alternative was we go out of business. We don't serve our customers. We literally just are unable to do things. And so when you talked about the tide going in, the tide going out, and that, you know, there's certain areas of a beach where if you go, you know, during a low tide, you might get stranded there during a high tide, dangerously so, right? So this idea that in 2020, we made some decisions based on a negotiated level of risk, we might find in 2021 that we're stranded on an area of beach that puts us in a dangerous situation, out of compliance with GDPR or HIPAA or other, you know, non-negotiables that sooner or later, you know, those things are going to come back and bite us. The other piece that I think is important is there's a recognition that our visibility to what the levels of authority, or I call altitudes of authority and accountability, are very, very different. So frontline staff frequently literally don't understand what the authority and accountability that happens at the boardroom or at the senior executive level, because it's you don't go around saying, dude, are you going to lose your job here? Or, like I will. That's just completely inappropriate. But those altitudes are very, very different. And so I think what a lot of organizations have done historically is we've moved into a very, very risk adverse, a very safe and stable environment that if you stay within these safe boundaries, nothing bad could possibly happen. And it's not necessarily a bad model. It's designed for, or it's optimized for, a very static organization. And no organization in a modern business context is that static that you can do that. And so, whereas in that environment, you don't allow people to take risks. You don't delegate decision-making authority. Your job is to follow the guidelines that we have given to you. So as we transition into agile organizations, we have to define what the decision-making structure is, what levels of authority and accountability are going to be there, so that people can make appropriate decisions based on appropriate level of risk to pursue the objectives of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of risk, every time we record an episode, it's a risk.
Because somebody might say something that we wanted to edit out.
Or given this motley crew.
Yeah,
exactly. This mega bunch of cohorts that I hang with every Friday. Sometimes you're just not quite sure where those filters are sitting. So, Mark, you've been listening to a lot of our episodes. You understand our risks.
Is that because I say things you have to edit out? Is that why you went directly to me?
Oh, absolutely not. I was just thinking about how.
I was going to say, how
Greg
ironic that Simone
is
saying this to me.
This is where I was going. It's like Simone, who left her filter back in Australia when she went to Europe. Like,
it's interesting.
I was just opening myself up for another experience. What can I say?
So I've got a couple things that I've listened to here in the last couple of minutes. Kathy was taking us to the street view. She said, "All right, let's talk from an execution from the ground up, because what has to happen now, I'm a project manager, I'm an IT technician, sysadmin, whatnot, and I have to make decisions, but I don't know that the appetite level or the tolerance levels that I have for that." And so Dee follows it up and says, "Hey, now we've got to have clarity, we've got to have trust." So there's this gap now that's right in the middle. So I'm sitting on a board, and we say, "Well, what's our risk appetite level?" The board says, "We have a high risk appetite level." And this is what boards do. They say we're high, medium, or low in many cases. How do you take a board that says, "Hey, we're not taking any risk this year"? Well, that doesn't make any sense. We always take risks. So how do we take this risk appetite and tolerance levels from the board? And how do I apply that to know that as a project manager, my risk tolerance for project closure is I can't have more than 10% budget overrun and so many weeks over. So how does that decision get made based on the risk saying we're not taking any risk this year? And so that's really difficult. And so it goes back to a lot of things that Greg hit just a second ago. And actually, Patty pushed on this a little bit too, is that delegation of authority and that trust and those kinds of things. And I think that if you look at, the risk appetite, those types of things, that's what that's for. It's so the board can say, hey, 3 years ago, the board would say, hey, don't spend any money. We're in a bad market right now, right? Don't take any risks. Only spend money to save money, okay? But 3 years later, we just happen to be in a different cash position. And now the business is saying, hey, we'll invest all kinds of money, right? So that changes, to keep your finger on the pulse of that. And that's why I think a lot of people assume that a governance structure is static and you have no agility. But if you have the right agility built into that delegation of authorities, and that's really cool. And Greg hit something that is really, really important to me, and that is, if you think about the whole idea of a standard change, right? What is a standard change? Low risk, well understood. I can nominate you as a local authority, and as long as you're making these decisions within these attributes or boundaries, you're protected. And that's what people need to know is, if you make decisions under the Aegis, but you make those decisions based on the attributes or how you're, if it goes wrong, don't worry, you're protected. And I think that's what's happening to a lot of people. Greg said, hey, dude, are you getting fired? Well, that's a bad one, because you should know that if you don't follow the rules right, you should know that you're not protected. But if you did the right stuff, and I don't think that clarity is being propagated through a lot of the organizations. Even an organization that's going flat, right? You still know what your decision authority is. Now, there's a point where you no longer have that authority under certain conditions, and it has to be escalated somewhere, somehow. And I do think, from a culture perspective, that I think a lot of organizations have really misused their recognition and their reward systems, because what we do, we make decisions based on how well we're going to get recognized or rewarded for that. And it's not always financial, but I think that if we continue through that kind of reward structure, it also has to match the organization's values. Well, so one of the things that came up earlier was the principles and the values. Those they're so important, and a lot of people do that just to think it's a checklist item that we have to do. But man, over time, your values could change. I value things differently
Yeah.
now than I did when I was 25 years old, but my principles really haven't changed much. And all the decisions I make, my life decisions I make, are, in the back of my head, those principles and values are driving that. So anyway, that's kind of my piece on that, because I
Yeah.
think that the risk appetite and tolerance levels, being able to communicate that down to the street view. So I know the decision I'm making, I'm protected.
I love it's funny how we use the term risk appetite. I just have this idea of sitting down to a governance meal
Yeah.
of all those components and deciding, what am I allergic to? What's going to give me indigestion? How much can I actually eat? And a lot of that actually has to do with my budget as well. Roy, what kind of wisdom have you got stored from your experiences about risk appetite and indigestion?
Oh dear. Well, I think I've actually told this story before on this at some point on KTLO about Mike Madman Mahoney, who was somebody that I worked with back in 19 as a sandhog, a proud working member of the International Brotherhood of Caisson Bridge and Tunnel Workers. And Madman was tasked with a particular job, which was to go out on a concrete subway platform, which was suspended in the middle of a 60-foot round tunnel, and chip the concrete out from underneath himself. Right. That's a pretty high risk task that Madman, and everybody knew it was going to fall, and Madman was going to go drop the 30 feet into the bottom of the tunnel, including Madman. He went and did it anyway, which is why he was called Madman. But that, there are many occasions or many jobs or tasks or careers in which risk is extraordinarily high. I think of, when my brother was in the military, doing night aircraft carrier landings might be a fairly high risk undertaking. Sometimes it doesn't go well. And yet it's a necessary thing. So I think that's part of it too. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, is the purpose you have drives the amount of risk you can and should be taking on, right? What is the outcome ultimately of what you're seeking to do? And what is the impact of the organization? Something that Greg talks a lot about is the impact, the blast zone, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. But
Mm.
think of Madman when you think about risk.
All I can think about is, the gambling, the Las Vegas. It's just it all seems to come into place when I think of the term madman. Greg, speaking of mad, how mad are organizations when it comes to strong central governance? I mean, they keep saying, we want to be agile, we want to be fluid, we want to be able to turn on a dime, but no, we've got to stay, in command and control. I mean, come on, how is this going to work together?
Wow. So that's more than one episode or a few
It
minutes
is.
of an episode. But the thing is, what organizations aspire to or say they want to do is very, very different than the culture that they've built and maintained to support it. So the level of decision, autonomous decision making, delegation of authority, risk taking at lower levels, for lack of a better term, within an organization, those are all cultural elements. And I talk a lot about that when I talk about digital leadership, because I now recognize that the kind of leadership to fully execute the responsibilities of a senior management, where you're paying attention to governance, risk, compliance, Wall Street, other expectations, and building a culture for performance and execution is a very unique set of skills in today's world. And what we've been doing for the last 100 years, for the last 50 years, even the last 10 years, is not going to make us successful going forward. So when people say we're going to do Agile or we're going to do DevOps, and they're really pushing that down of you people out there in IT, you go, if you can be faster, that'd be great. Well, the culture to support that and execute your governance requirements through that, as Mark described, is a very big challenge. And I think Patty should go back and kind of articulate what she was saying. She was talking about layers. And people say, for instance, we've been a command and control organization, company started in the 1800s, and we want to be agile. Well, that's about 6 notches away culturally from where you were. And that's not a leap that people can make. That's not a leap that humans can make. I can only move a few notches away from what I know and understand. And so I have to take a series of steps to become that kind of an organization. And most organizations are unwilling or unable to make the long-term investment to move in that direction. And that's the challenge that I think we face.
Isn't it interesting you say a word like agile, and they think that, it kind of reminds me of Samantha on Bewitched. Let me just wiggle my nose. It just happens.
Agile is such a attractive word. It's like, who doesn't want their organization to be more agile? Right?
Exactly. You ask the question, they'll all say yes, but are they willing to put in the effort to get there is the next question. And I'm throwing that over to you, Patty, because this is time to call it out.
This is my hot topic, right? That working in transformation, I've run up the hill with a lot of organizations who call it transactional move transformation, but they're unwilling to take on a few things, and they're big things. This is, if we say we want this, we need the organizational structure, design, reporting structure, and a few other things like finance to actually follow that model and understand where they fit in that model. One I pick on often is continuous improvement. We talk about continuous improvement, and we hear over and over and over at client sites where someone will say, hey, listen, you people down there, I need you to change. I need you to take care of this, and have blinders on for how they can not possibly do it without having a structural support in the organization, different decision-making rights for the transformation, the ability for finance to actually support a continuous improvement model as opposed to a project by project model. And then we have a lack of training for leaders. How many people here, you put your hands up because I know it's all of us, have been in an organization that was acquired by someone else, and all the governance changed and the leader changed. And suddenly everything we were allowed to do before, we are no longer allowed to do, right? This is gap we have, a massive gap in understanding the interpretation by a leader of what that organizational governance and what the governance says and what they imply it as, and as they push it down. And that's where, you know, Mark was talking about what's our risk appetite. Sometimes that's based on personality. That's based on, I'm afraid of the board, or I'm afraid of the CEO, or I'm afraid of, right? And so some of that needs to be really reviewed and looked at. And I think anyone that builds a proper governance structure includes things like, what are we going to tolerate and what won't we tolerate in terms of the behavior in this organization culturally? Because if they don't look at the culture, they're missing the point. So I went on three different tangents there, but they're all things that really mean something powerfully to me as I work with clients.
They are all part of that whole governance conversation that we're having. There is no way out. This is what I think a lot of people, that misunderstanding, Roy, you were talking about earlier, they've misunderstood what governance is really about. They just think it's purely about having these controls in place. And that's not it at all. It's about all those other things that we've discussed. And I like, you know, again, back to that risk appetite. Some people are willing to take the risk, but they're really smart because they've put those structures in place. They've put the guidelines and the policies and the decision making in place where they can take the risk. It's like having the Alka-Seltzer the next morning, isn't it? That's, I mean, you know, when I think of those sorts of things, it's like, what's my backup? What is my support? Where is my protection?
Well,
so
as far as your next morning analogy is concerned there, Simone, I'll just plead Sergeant Schultz on that one. I know nothing.
So what are some of the characteristics of good governance, Roy?
Well, I think that Dee absolutely nailed it when she said absolutely clear, absolutely caring, and absolutely credible. Those three characteristics are going to be, and I'm going to put us in gallery view here. Those three characteristics prevent as much as possible. And I think I mentioned the word clarity when I talked about the telephone game. We need to be clear and credible when we pass that message along. And if we are clear and credible, and it needs to be short and simple. And this is one of the things that where mission and vision statements go awry. You know, when they get to 2 paragraphs, you're done. Nobody's going to read it. Nobody's going to buy it. Nobody's going to remember it. Clear and caring is such a great element of that, Dee. I'm always one who, and we have humanizing IT people here, and I think humanizing the organization and recognizing that people have human needs and human families and human prices that they're willing to pay and not is one of the things that makes governance work or not. You know, the 2-minute bathroom break for contact center people is just insanity. That's not a caring. It's not a caring rule or guideline. And so those 3 things that are just this has been a good discussion. I think it went in some directions that I didn't expect it to, and look at all of us here on the screen.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It is,
all of these different bodies and faces and experiences.
And locations. Look at us. We're all over the map here. This is great. The wonders of technology. We are blessed in having this tremendous pandemic now, when at least we have the ability to use this technology to connect with each other. Back in 1918, when my own father was watching the bodies stack up in the streets during the pandemic, they did not have this. I mean, there was some telephone connection, but it certainly wasn't very widespread. So did he have the ability to connect with other members of his family and so forth? No. And so we are very lucky to have this ability to do this. So we thank those IT folks who keep coming up with this wonderful technology.
Absolutely.
And whether they get it or not, as long as they keep it coming down the road, we'll deal. So thanks to everyone. Thank you to Simone for being our interviewer du jour. or Greg Sanker and Dee Burgoyne. Thank you, Dee. And Patty Blackstaff, Mark Thomas. This is like the Brady Bunch, isn't it? Kathy Veldboom and Daniel Breston.
No,
Great.
I was actually thinking more about the country western thing.
Oh, the
Good night,
country
John
western
Boy.
thing.
Don't forget D and V.
Just
D and
remember that
Kathy.
if you, I'm sorry, Greg. What?
Don't forget D and Kathy.
I don't think I did forget Dee and
No,
Kathy.
he didn't.
You did. I just said Dee and Kathy so clearly and well that you didn't even hear it. See, here we
Daniel,
go with
you
the telephone
forgot Dee
game
and
again.
Kathy.
Yeah.
See, there you go. So in any event, going back to the country western theme, I'll leave you with this thought or question. What happens when you play? You should never play a record backwards. That's part of governance, right? You should never play a record backwards. When you do play a country western record backwards, what happens?
I know the answer.
You get your dog back, you get your truck back, you get your wife back. So with that thought, I
You
leave
just
you.
created our little pocket of happiness for the
Yes,
week.
good. My job here is done. I thank you all. I'm going to end the YouTube stream now. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be around next week on KTLO, keeping the learning in one direction or another. Good. Okay. Thank you.